Sovereignty of the nation-state. Foreigners, please don't leave us alone with the French. Paris Graffito, 1995. We thought we were dying for the fatherland. We realized quickly it was for the bank vaults. Anatole, France. As European modernity progressively took shape, machines of power were constructed to respond to its crisis, searching continually for a surplus that would resolve or at least contain the crisis. In the previous section, we traced the path of one response to the crisis that led to the development of the modern sovereign state. The second approach centers on the concept of nation, a development that presupposes the first path and builds on it to construct a more perfect mechanism to re-establish order and command. Birth of the nation. The concept of nation in Europe developed on the terrain of the patrimonial and absolutist state. The patrimonial state was defined as the property of the monarch. In a variety of analogous forms in different countries throughout Europe, the patrimonial and absolutist state was the political form required to rule feudal social relations and relations of production. Feudal property had to be delegated, and its usage assigned according to the degrees of the social division of power, in the same way that levels of administration would have to be delegated in subsequent centuries. Feudal property was part of the body of the monarch, just as, if we shift our view toward the metaphysical domain, the sovereign monarchic body was part of the body of God. In the 16th century, in the midst of the Reformation and that violent battle among the forces of modernity, the patrimonial monarchy was still presented as the guarantee of peace and social life. It was still granted control over social development in such a way that it could absorb that process within its machine of domination. Cujus regio, ejus religio. Or really, religion had to be subordinated to the territorial control of the sovereign. There was nothing diplomatic about this adage. On the contrary, it confided entirely to the power of the patrimonial sovereign the management of the passage to the new order. Even religion was the sovereign's property. In the 17th century, the absolutist reaction to the revolutionary forces of modernity celebrated the patrimonial monarchic state and wielded it as a weapon for its own purposes. At that point, however, the celebration of the patrimonial state could not but be paradoxical and ambiguous, since the feudal bases of its power were withering away. The processes of the primitive accumulation of capital imposed new conditions on all the structures of power. Until the era of the three great bourgeois revolutions, the English, the American, and the French, there was no political alternative that could successfully oppose this model. The absolutist and patrimonial model survived in this period only with the support of a specific compromise of political forces, and its substance was eroding from the inside, owing primarily to the emergence of new productive forces. The model did survive nonetheless, and, much more important, it was transformed through the development of some fundamental characteristics that would be bequeathed to successive centuries. The transformation of the absolutist and patrimonial model consisted in a gradual process that replaced the theological foundation of territorial patrimony with a new foundation that was equally transcendent. The spiritual identity of the nation, rather than the divine body of the king, now posed the territory and population as an ideal abstraction. Or rather, the physical territory and population were conceived as the extension of the transcendent essence of the nation. The modern concept of nation thus inherited the patrimonial body of the monarchic state and reinvented it in a new form. This new totality of power was structured in part by new capitalist productive processes on the one hand, and old networks of absolutist administration on the other. This uneasy structural relationship was stabilized by the national identity, a cultural, integrating identity founded on a biological continuity of blood relations, a spatial continuity of territory, and linguistic commonality. It is obvious that, although this process preserved the materiality of the relationship to the sovereign, many elements changed. Most important, as the patrimonial horizon was transformed into the national horizon, the feudal order of the subject, subjectus, yielded to the disciplinary order of the citizen, cives. The shift of the population from subjects to citizens was an index of the shift from a passive to an active role. The nation is always presented as an active force, as a generative form of social and political relations. As Benedict Anderson and others point out, the nation is often experienced as, or at least functions as if it were, a collective imagining, an active creation of the community of citizens. At this point, we can see both the proximity and the specific difference between the concepts of patrimonial state and national state. The latter faithfully reproduces the former's totalizing identity of both the territory and the population, but the nation and the national state propose new means of overcoming the precariousness of modern sovereignty. These concepts reify sovereignty in the most rigid way. They make the relation of sovereignty into a thing, often by naturalizing it, and thus weed out every residue of social antagonism. The nation is a kind of ideological shortcut that attempts to free the concepts of sovereignty and modernity from the antagonism and crisis that define them. National sovereignty suspends the conflictual origins of modernity, when they are not definitively destroyed, and it closes the alternative paths within modernity that had refused to concede their powers to state authority. The transformation of the concept of modern sovereignty into that of national sovereignty also required certain new material conditions. Most important, it required that a new equilibrium be established between the processes of capitalist accumulation and the structures of power. The political victory of the bourgeoisie, as the English and French revolutions show well, corresponded to the perfecting of the concept of modern sovereignty through that of national sovereignty. Behind the ideal dimension of the concept of nation, there were the class figures that already dominated the processes of accumulation. Nation was thus at once both the hypostasis of the Rousseauian general will and what manufacturing ideology conceived as the community of needs, that is, the capitalist regulation of the market. That in the long era of primitive accumulation in Europe was more or less liberal and always bourgeois. When in the 19th and 20th centuries the concept of nation was taken up in very different ideological contexts and led popular mobilizations in regions and countries within and outside Europe that had experienced neither the liberal revolution nor the same level of primitive accumulation, it still always was presented as a concept of capitalist modernization, which claimed to bring together the interclass demands for political unity and the needs of economic development. In other words, the nation was posed as the one and only active vehicle that could deliver modernity and development. Rosa Luxemburg argued vehemently and futilely against nationalism in the debates internal to the Third International in the years before the First World War. Luxemburg opposed a policy of national self-determination for Poland as an element of the revolutionary platform, but her indictment of nationalism was much more general. Her critique of the nation was not merely a critique of modernization as such, although she was no doubt keenly aware of the ambiguities involved in capitalist development. And she was not primarily concerned with the divisions that nationalisms would inevitably create within the European working class, although her own nomadic passage through Central and Eastern Europe certainly made her extremely sensitive to this. Luxemburg's most powerful argument, rather, was that nation means dictatorship, and is thus profoundly incompatible with any attempt at democratic organization. Luxemburg recognized that national sovereignty and national mythologies effectively usurp the terrain of democratic organization by renewing the powers of territorial sovereignty and modernizing its project through the mobilization of an active community. The process of constructing the nation, which renewed the concept of sovereignty and gave it a new definition, quickly became, in each and every historical context, an ideological nightmare. The crisis of modernity, which is the contradictory co-presence of the multitude, and a power that wants to reduce it to the rule of one, that is, the co-presence of a new productive set of free subjectivities, and a disciplinary power that wants to exploit it, is not finally pacified or resolved by the concept of nation, any more than it was by the concept of sovereignty or state. The nation can only mask the crisis ideologically, displace it, and defer its power. The nation and the crisis of modernity. Jean Bodin's work lies at the head of the road in European thought that leads to the concept of national sovereignty. His masterwork, Les 6 Livres de la République, which first appeared in 1576, right in the middle of the Renaissance crisis, addressed the current civil and religious wars in France and Europe as its fundamental problem. Bodin confronted political crises, conflicts, and war, but these elements of rupture did not lead him to pose any idyllic alternative, not even in simply theoretical or utopian terms. This is why Bodin's work was not only a seminal contribution to the modern definition of sovereignty, but also an effective anticipation of the subsequent development of sovereignty in national terms. By adopting a realistic standpoint, he managed to anticipate modernity's own critique of sovereignty. Sovereignty, Bodin claimed, cannot be produced by the unity of the prince and the multitude, the public and the private, nor can its problem be resolved so long as one holds to either a contractualist or a natural right framework. Really, the origin of political power and the definition of sovereignty consist in the victory of one side over the other, a victory that makes the one sovereign and the other subject. Force and violence create the sovereign. The physical determinations of power impose the plenitudo potestatis, the fullness of power. This is the plenitude and the unity of power, since the union of the Republic's members depends on unity under a single ruler, on whom the effectiveness of all the rest depends. A sovereign prince is therefore indispensable, for it is his power which informs all the members of the Republic. After discarding the framework of natural right and the transcendental perspectives that it always in some way invokes, Bodin presents us with a figure of the sovereign, or rather the state, that realistically and thus historically constructs its own origin and structure. The modern state arose from within this transformation, and only there could it continue to develop. This is the theoretical hinge on which the theory of modern sovereignty is linked to and perfects the experience of territorial sovereignty. By taking up Roman law and drawing on its capacities to articulate the sources of right and order the forms of property, Bodin's doctrine became a theory of a united political body articulated as administration that appeared to surmount the difficulties of the crisis of modernity. The displacement of the center of theoretical consideration from the question of legitimacy to that of the life of the state and its sovereignty as a united body constituted an important advance. When Bodin spoke of the political right of sovereignty, he already anticipated the national and corporeal overdetermination of sovereignty, and he thus opened an original and direct path that would stretch forward across the subsequent centuries. After Bodin, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there developed in Europe simultaneously two schools of thought that also accorded the theme of sovereignty a central role and effectively anticipated the concept of national sovereignty: the natural right tradition and the realist or historicist tradition of state theory. Both schools mediated the transcendental conception of sovereignty with a realistic methodology that grasped the terms of the material conflict. Both brought together the construction of the sovereign state with a constitution of the socio-political community that later would be called nation. As in Bodin, both of these schools continually confronted the crisis of the theoretical conception of sovereignty, which was itself continually reopened by the antagonistic powers of modernity and the juridical and administrative construction of the figure of the state. In the natural right school, from Grotius to Althusius, and from Thomasius to Puffendorf, the transcendental figures of sovereignty were brought down to earth and grounded in the reality of the institutional and administrative processes. Sovereignty was distributed by setting in motion a system of multiple contracts designed to intervene on every node of the administrative structure of power. This process was not oriented toward the apex of the state and the mere title of sovereignty. Rather, the problem of legitimation began to be addressed in terms of an administrative machine that functioned through the articulations of the exercise of power. The circle of sovereignty and obedience closed in on itself, duplicating itself, multiplying, and extending across social reality. Sovereignty came to be studied less from the perspective of the antagonists involved in the crisis of modernity, and more as an administrative process that articulates these antagonisms and aims toward a unity in the dialectic of power, abstracting and reifying it through the historical dynamics. An important segment of the natural right school thus developed the idea of distributing and articulating the transcendent sovereignty through the real forms of administration. The synthesis that was implicit in the natural right school, however, became explicit in the context of historicism. Certainly, it would be incorrect to attribute to the historicism of the Enlightenment the thesis that was really only developed later by the reactionary schools in the period after the French Revolution. The thesis, that is, that unites the theory of sovereignty with the theory of the nation, and grounds both of them in a common historical humus. And yet there are already in this period the seeds of that later development. Whereas an important segment of the natural right school developed the idea of articulating transcendent sovereignty through the real forms of administration, the historicist thinkers of the Enlightenment attempted to conceive the subjectivity of the historical process, and thereby find an effective ground for the title and exercise of sovereignty. In the work of Giambattista Vico, for example, the terrific meteor that shot across the age of enlightenment, the determinations of the juridical conception of sovereignty were all grounded in the power of historical development. The transcendent figures of sovereignty were translated into indexes of a providential process, which was at once both human and divine. This construction of sovereignty, or really reification of sovereignty, in history, was very powerful. On this historical terrain, which forces every ideological construct to confront reality, the genetic crisis of modernity was never closed, and there was no need for it to close, because the crisis itself produced new figures that incessantly spurred on historical and political development, all still under the rule of the transcendent sovereign. What an ingenious inversion of the problematic, and yet at the same time, what a complete mystification of sovereignty. The elements of the crisis, a continuous and unresolved crisis, were now considered active elements of progress. In effect, we can already recognize in Vico the embryo of Hegel's apologia of effectiveness, making the present world arrangement the telos of history. What remained hints and suggestions in Vico, however, emerged as an open and radical declaration in the late German Enlightenment. In the Hanover School first, and then in the work of J.G. Herder, the modern theory of sovereignty was directed exclusively toward the analysis of what was conceived as a social and cultural continuity, the real historical continuity of the territory, the population, and the nation. Vico's argument that ideal history is located in the history of all nations became more radical in Herder, so that every human perfection is, in a certain respect, national. Identity is thus conceived not as the resolution of social and historical differences, but as the product of a primordial unity. The nation is a complete figure of sovereignty prior to historical development. Or better, there is no historical development that is not already prefigured in the origin. In other words, the nation sustains the concept of sovereignty by claiming to precede it. It is the material engine that courses throughout history, the genius that works history. The nation becomes finally the condition of possibility of all human action and social life itself. The nation's people. Between the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, the concept of national sovereignty finally emerged in European thought in its completed form. At the base of this definitive figure of the concept were a trauma, the French Revolution, and the resolution of that trauma, the reactionary appropriation and celebration of the concept of nation. The fundamental elements of this swift reconfiguration of the concept of nation that made it a real political weapon can be seen in summary form in the work of Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. In his wonderful and libellous tract, What is the Third Estate?, he linked the concept of nation to that of the Third Estate, that is, the bourgeoisie. Sieyès tried to lead the concept of sovereignty back to its humanist origins and rediscover its revolutionary possibilities. More important for our purposes, Sieyès' intense engagement with revolutionary activity allowed him to interpret the concept of nation as a constructive political concept, a constitutional mechanism. It gradually becomes clear, however, particularly in Sieyès' later work, the work of his followers, and above all that of his detractors, that although the nation was formed through politics, it was ultimately a spiritual construction, and the concept of nation was thus stripped away from the revolution, consigned to all the thermidors. The nation became explicitly the concept that summarized the bourgeois hegemonic solution to the problem of sovereignty. At those points when the concept of nation has been presented as popular and revolutionary, as indeed it was during the French Revolution, one might assume that the nation has broken away from the modern concept of sovereignty and its apparatus of subjugation and domination, and is dedicated instead to a democratic notion of community. The link between the concept of nation and the concept of people was indeed a powerful innovation, and it did constitute the center of the Jacobin sensibility as well as that of other revolutionary groups. What appears as revolutionary and liberatory in this notion of national, popular sovereignty, however, is really nothing more than another turn of the screw, a further extension of the subjugation and domination that the modern concept of sovereignty has carried with it from the beginning. The precarious power of sovereignty as a solution to the crisis of modernity was first referred for support to the nation, and then when the nation too was revealed as a precarious solution, it was further referred to the people. In other words, just as the concept of nation completes the notion of sovereignty by claiming to precede it, so too the concept of the people completes that of nation through another feigned logical regression. Each logical step back functions to solidify the power of sovereignty by mystifying its basis, that is, by resting on the naturalness of the concept. The identity of the nation, and even more so the identity of the people, must appear natural and originary. We, by contrast, must denaturalize these concepts and ask what is a nation and how is it made, but also what is a people and how is it made. Although the people is posed as the originary basis of the nation, the modern conception of the people is in fact a product of the nation-state, and survives only within its specific ideological context. Many contemporary analyses of nations and nationalism, from a wide variety of perspectives, go wrong precisely because they rely unquestioningly on the naturalness of the concept and identity of the people. We should note that the concept of the people is very different from that of the multitude. Already in the 17th century, Hobbes was very mindful of this difference and its importance for the construction of sovereign order. It is a great hindrance to civil government, especially monarchical, that men distinguish not enough between a people and a multitude. The people is somewhat that is one, having one will, and to whom one action may be attributed. None of these can be properly said of the multitude. The people rules in all government, for even in monarchies the people commands. For the people wills by the will of one man, however it seem a paradox. The king is the people. The multitude is a multiplicity, a plane of singularities, an open set of relations, which is not homogeneous or identical with itself, and bears an indistinct, inclusive relation to those outside of it. The people, in contrast, tends towards identity and homogeneity internally, while posing its difference from and excluding what remains outside of it. Whereas the multitude is an inconclusive constituent relation, the people is a constituted synthesis that is prepared for sovereignty. The people provides a single will and action that is independent of and often in conflict with the various wills and actions of the multitude. Every nation must make the multitude into a people. Two fundamental kinds of operations contribute to the construction of the modern concept of the people in relation to that of the nation in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. The more important of these are the mechanisms of colonial racism that construct the identity of European peoples in a dialectical play of oppositions with their native others. The concepts of nation, people, and race are never very far apart. The construction of an absolute racial difference is the essential ground for the conception of a homogeneous national identity. Numerous excellent studies are appearing today when the pressures of immigration and multiculturalism are creating conflicts in Europe to demonstrate that, despite the persistent nostalgia of some, European societies and peoples were never really pure and uniform. The identity of the people was constructed on an imaginary plane that hid and/or eliminated differences, and this corresponded on the practical plane to racial subordination and social purification. The second fundamental operation in the construction of the people, which is facilitated by the first, is the eclipse of internal differences through the representation of the whole population by a hegemonic group, race, or class. The representative group is the active agent that stands behind the effectiveness of the concept of nation. In the course of the French Revolution itself, between Thermidor and the Napoleonic period, the concept of nation revealed its fundamental content and served as an antidote to the concept and forces of revolution. Even in Sieyès' early work, we can clearly see how the nation serves to placate the crisis and how sovereignty will be reappropriated through the representation of the bourgeoisie. Sieyès claims that a nation can have only one general interest. It would be impossible to establish order if the nation were to admit several different interests. Social order necessarily supposes the unity of ends and the concert of means. The concept of nation in these early years of the French Revolution was the first hypothesis of the construction of popular hegemony and the first conscious manifesto of a social class. But it was also the final declaration of a fully accomplished secular transformation, a coronation, a final seal. Never was the concept of nation so reactionary as when it presented itself as revolutionary. Paradoxically, this cannot but be a completed revolution, an end of history. The passage from revolutionary activity to the spiritual construction of the nation and the people is inevitable and implicit in the concepts themselves. National sovereignty and popular sovereignty were thus products of a spiritual construction, that is, a construction of identity. When Edmund Burke opposed Sieyès, his position was much less profoundly different than the torrid polemical climate of the age would lead us to believe. Even for Burke, in fact, national sovereignty is the product of a spiritual construction of identity. This fact can be recognized even more clearly in the work of those who carried the standard of the counter-revolutionary project on the European continent. The continental conceptions of this spiritual construction revived both the historical and the voluntarist traditions of the nation, and added to the conception of historical development a transcendental synthesis in national sovereignty. This synthesis is always already accomplished in the identity of the nation and the people. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, for example, claims in more or less mythological terms that the fatherland and the people are representatives and gauges of earthly eternity. They are what here on earth can be immortal. The Romantic counter-revolution was, in fact, more realistic than the Enlightenment revolution. It framed and fixed what was already accomplished, celebrating it in the eternal light of hegemony. The third estate is power. The nation is its totalizing representation. The people is its solid and natural foundation. And national sovereignty is the apex of history. Every historical alternative to bourgeois hegemony has thus been definitively surpassed through the bourgeoisie's own revolutionary history. This bourgeois formulation of the concept of national sovereignty surpassed by far all the previous formulations of modern sovereignty. It consolidated a particular and hegemonic image of modern sovereignty, the image of the victory of the bourgeoisie, which it then both historicized and universalized. National particularity is a potent universality. All the threads of a long development were woven together here. In the identity, that is, the spiritual essence of the people and the nation, there is a territory embedded with cultural meanings, a shared history, and a linguistic community. But moreover, there is the consolidation of a class victory, a stable market, the potential for economic expansion, and new spaces to invest and civilize. In short, the construction of national identity guarantees a continually reinforced legitimation and the right and power of a sacrosanct and irrepressible unity. This is a decisive shift in the concept of sovereignty. Married to the concepts of nation and people, the modern concept of sovereignty shifts its epicenter from the mediation of conflicts and crisis to the unitary experience of a nation's subject and its imagined community. Subaltern Nationalism. We have been focusing our attention up to this point on the development of the concept of nation in Europe, while Europe was in the process of achieving world dominance. Outside of Europe, however, the concept of nation has often functioned very differently. In some respects, in fact, one might even say that the function of the concept of nation is inverted when deployed among subordinated rather than dominant groups. Stated most boldly, it appears that whereas the concept of nation promotes stasis and restoration in the hands of the dominant, it is a weapon for change and revolution in the hands of the subordinated. The progressive nature of subaltern nationalism is defined by two primary functions, each of which is highly ambiguous. Most important, the nation appears as progressive insofar as it serves as a line of defense against the domination of more powerful nations and external economic, political, and ideological forces. The right to self-determination of subaltern nations is really a right to secession from the control of dominant powers. Anti-colonial struggles thus use the concept of nation as a weapon to defeat and expel the occupying enemy, and anti-imperialist politics similarly erected national walls to obstruct the overpowering forces of foreign capital. The concept of nation also served as an ideological weapon to ward off the dominant discourse that figured the dominated population and culture as inferior. The claim to nationhood affirmed the dignity of the people and legitimated the demand for independence and equality. In each of these cases, the nation is progressive strictly as a fortified line of defense against more powerful external forces. As much as those walls appear progressive in their protective function against external domination, however, they can easily play an inverse role with respect to the interior they protect. The flip side of the structure that resists foreign powers is itself a dominating power that exerts an equal and opposite internal oppression, repressing internal difference and opposition in the name of national identity, unity, and security. Protection and oppression can be hard to tell apart. This strategy of national protection is a double-edged sword that at times appears necessary, despite its destructiveness. The nation appears progressive in the second place insofar as it poses the commonality of a potential community. Part of the modernizing effects of the nation in subordinated countries has been the unification of diverse populations, breaking down religious, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic barriers. The unification of countries such as Indonesia, China, and Brazil, for example, is an ongoing process that involves overcoming innumerable such barriers. And in many cases, this national unification was prepared by the European colonial power. In cases of diasporic populations, too, the nation seems at times to be the only concept available under which to imagine the community of the subaltern group. As, for example, the Aztlán is imagined as the geographical homeland of La Raza, the spiritual Latino nation in North America. It may be true, as Benedict Anderson says, that a nation should be understood as an imagined community, But here we should recognize that the claim is inverted, so that the nation becomes the only way to imagine community. Every imagination of a community becomes overcoded as a nation, and hence our conception of community is severely impoverished. Just as in the context of the dominant countries, here too the multiplicity and singularity of the multitude are negated in the straitjacket of the identity and homogeneity of the people. Once again, the unifying power of the subaltern nation is a double-edged sword, at once progressive and reactionary. Both of these simultaneously progressive and regressive aspects of subaltern nationalism are present in all their ambiguity in the tradition of black nationalism in the United States. Although deprived, as it is, of any territorial definition, and thus undoubtedly different from the majority of other subaltern nationalisms, it too presents the two fundamental progressive functions, sometimes by striving to pose itself in an analogous position to the proper, territorially defined nations. In the early 1960s, for example, after the enormous impetus created by the Bandung Conference and the emerging African and Latin American national liberation struggles, Malcolm X attempted to redirect the focus of demands of African American struggles from civil rights to human rights, and thus rhetorically shift the forum of appeal from the US Congress to the UN General Assembly. Malcolm X, like many African American leaders, at least since Marcus Garvey, clearly recognized the powerful position of speaking as a nation and a people. The concept of nation here configures a defensive position of separation from the hegemonic external power, and at the same time represents the autonomous power of the unified community, the power of the people. More important than any such theoretical and rhetorical propositions, however, are the actual practices of black nationalism, that is, the wide variety of activities and phenomena that are conceived by the actors themselves as expressions of black nationalism, from community drill teams and parades to meal programs, separate schools, and projects of community economic development and self-sufficiency. As Wahneema Lubiano puts it, black nationalism is significant for the ubiquity of its presence in black American lives. In all these various activities and realms of life, black nationalism names precisely the circuits of self-valorization that constitute the community and allow for its relative self-determination and self-constitution. Despite the range of disparate phenomena called black nationalism, then, we can still recognize in them the two fundamental progressive functions of subaltern nationalism, the defense and the unification of the community. Black nationalism can name any expression of the separation and autonomous power of the African American people. In the case of black nationalism too, however, the progressive elements are accompanied inevitably by their reactionary shadows. The repressive forces of nation and people feed off the self-valorization of the community and destroy its multiplicity. When black nationalism poses the uniformity and homogeneity of the African American people as its basis, eclipsing class differences, for example, or when it designates one segment of the community, such as African American men, as de facto representatives of the whole, the profound ambiguity of subaltern nationalism's progressive functions emerges as clearly as ever. Precisely the structures that play a defensive role with respect to the outside, in the interest of furthering the power, autonomy, and unity of the community, are the same that play an oppressive role internally, negating the multiplicity of the community itself. We should emphasize, however, that these ambiguous progressive functions of the concept of nation exist primarily when nation is not effectively linked to sovereignty, that is, when the imagined nation does not yet exist, when the nation remains merely a dream. As soon as the nation begins to form a sovereign state, its progressive functions all but vanish. Jean Genet was enchanted by the revolutionary desire of the Black Panthers and the Palestinians, but he recognized that becoming a sovereign nation would be the end of their revolutionary qualities. The day when the Palestinians are institutionalized, he said, I will no longer be at their side. The day the Palestinians become a nation like the other nations, I will no longer be there. With national liberation and the construction of the nation-state, all of the oppressive functions of modern sovereignty inevitably blossom in full force. Totalitarianism of the nation-state. When the nation-state does function as an institution of sovereignty, does it finally manage to resolve the crisis of modernity? Does the concept of the people and its biopolitical displacement of sovereignty succeed in shifting the terms and the terrain of the synthesis between constituent power and constituted power, and between the dynamic of productive forces and relations of production, in such a way as to carry us beyond the crisis? A vast panorama of authors, poets, and politicians, often emerging from progressive, socialist, and anti-imperialist movements, have certainly thought so. The conversion of the 19th century Jacobin left into a national left, the more and more intense adoption of national programs in the Second and Third Internationals, and the nationalist forms of liberation struggles in the colonial and post-colonial world, all the way up to today's resistance of nations to the processes of globalization and the catastrophes they provoke. All this seems to support the view that the nation-state does afford a new dynamic beyond the historical and conceptual disaster of the modern sovereign state. We have a different perspective on the function of the nation, however, and in our view, the crisis of modernity remains resolutely open under the rule of the nation and its people. When we take up again our genealogy of the concept of sovereignty in 19th and 20th century Europe, it is clear that the state form of modernity first fell into the nation-state form. Then the nation-state form descended into a whole series of barbarisms. When class struggle reopened and mystified synthesis of modernity in the early decades of the 20th century and demonstrated again the powerful antithesis between the state and the multitude, and between productive forces and relations of production, that antithesis led directly to a European civil war, a civil war that was nonetheless cloaked in the guise of conflicts among sovereign nation-states. In the Second World War, Nazi Germany, along with the various European fascisms, stood opposed to socialist Russia. Nations were presented as mystifications of, or stand-ins for, the class subjects in conflict. If Nazi Germany is the ideal type of the transformation of modern sovereignty into national sovereignty, and of its articulation in capitalist form, then Stalinist Russia is the ideal type of the transformation of popular interest, and the cruel logics that follow from it into a project of national modernization, mobilizing for its own purposes the productive forces that yearn for liberation from capitalism. Here we could analyze the National Socialist apotheosis of the modern concept of sovereignty and its transformation into national sovereignty. Nothing could more clearly demonstrate the coherence of this passage than the transfer of power from the Prussian monarchy to Hitler's regime, under the good auspices of the German bourgeoisie. This passage, however, is well known, as are the explosive violence of this transfer of power, the exemplary obedience of the German people, their military and civil valor in the service of the nation, and the secondary consequences that we can call, in a kind of intellectual shorthand, Auschwitz, as symbol of the Jewish Holocaust, and Buchenwald, as symbol of the extermination of communists, homosexuals, gypsies, and others. Let us leave this story to other scholars, and to the disgrace of history. We are more interested here with the other side of the national question in Europe during this era. In other words, what really happened when nationalism went hand in hand with socialism in Europe? In order to respond to this question, we have to revisit a few central moments in the history of European socialism. In particular, we must remember that not long after its inception, between the middle and end of the 19th century, the Socialist International had to come to terms with strong nationalist movements. And through this confrontation, the original internationalist passion of the workers' movement quickly evaporated. The policies of the strongest European workers' movements in Germany, Austria, France, and above all England, immediately raised the banner of national interest. Social democratic reformism was entirely invested in this compromise, conceived in the name of the nation, a compromise between class interests, that is, between the proletariat and certain strata of the bourgeois hegemonic structure in each country. Let's not even talk about the ignoble history of betrayal in which segments of the European workers' movement supported the imperialist enterprises of the European nation-states, nor the unpardonable folly that brought together the various European reformisms in consenting to the masses being led to slaughter in the First World War. Social democratic reformism did have an adequate theory for these positions. Several Austrian social democratic professors invented it, contemporaries of Musil's Count Leinsdorf. In the idyllic atmosphere of Alpine Campania, in the gentle intellectual climate of that return to Kant, these professors, such as Otto Bauer, insisted on the necessity of considering nationality a fundamental element of modernization. In fact, they believed that from the confrontation between nationality, defined as a community of character, and capitalist development, understood as society, there would emerge a dialectic that in its unfolding would eventually favor the proletariat and its progressive hegemony in society. This program ignored the fact that the concept of nation-state is not divisible, but rather organic, not transcendental, but transcendent. And even in its transcendence, it is constructed to oppose every tendency on the part of the proletariat to reappropriate social spaces and social wealth. What then could modernization mean if it is fundamentally tied to the reform of the capitalist system and inimical to any opening of the revolutionary process? These authors celebrated the nation without wanting to pay the price of this celebration. Or better, they celebrated it while mystifying the destructive power of the concept of nation. Given this perspective, support for the imperialist projects and the anti-imperialist war were really logical and inevitable positions for social democratic reformism. Bolshevism, too, entered the terrain of nationalist mythology, particularly through Stalin's celebrated pre-revolutionary pamphlet on Marxism and the national question. According to Stalin, nations are immediately revolutionary, and revolution means modernization. Nationalism is an ineluctable stage in development. Through Stalin's translation, however, as nationalism becomes socialist, so socialism becomes Russian, and Ivan the Terrible is laid to rest in the tomb beside Lenin. The Communist International is transformed into an assembly of the fifth column of Russian national interests. The notion of communist revolution, the deterritorializing spectre that had haunted Europe and the world, and that from the Paris Commune to 1917 in St. Petersburg, and to Mao's Long March, had managed to bring together deserters, internationalist partisans, striking workers, and cosmopolitan intellectuals, was finally made into a re-territorializing regime of national sovereignty. It is a tragic irony that nationalist socialism in Europe came to resemble National Socialism. This is not because the two extremes meet, as some liberals would like to think, but because the abstract machine of national sovereignty is at the heart of both. When, in the midst of the Cold War, the concept of totalitarianism was introduced into political science, it only touched on extrinsic elements of the question. In its most coherent form, the concept of totalitarianism was used to denounce the destruction of the democratic public sphere, the continuation of Jacobinist ideologies, the extreme forms of racist nationalism, and the negation of market forces. The concept of totalitarianism, however, ought to delve much more deeply into the real phenomena, and at the same time give a better explanation of them. In fact, totalitarianism consists not simply in totalizing the effects of social life and subordinating them to a global disciplinary norm, but also in the negation of social life itself, the erosion of its foundation, and the theoretical and practical stripping away of the very possibility of the existence of the multitude. What is totalitarian is the organic foundation and the unified source of society and the state. The community is not a dynamic collective creation, but a primordial founding myth. An originary notion of the people poses an identity that homogenizes and purifies the image of the population, while blocking the constructive interactions of differences within the multitude. Sieyès saw the embryo of totalitarianism already in 18th century conceptions of national and popular sovereignty, conceptions that effectively preserved the absolute power of monarchy and transferred it to national sovereignty. he glimpsed the future of what might be called totalitarian democracy. In the debate over the constitution of year 3 of the French Revolution, Sieyès denounced the bad plans for a re-total, ré-total, instead of a republic, république, which would be fatal for freedom and ruinous for both the public realm and the private. The concept of nation and the practices of nationalism are from the beginning set down on the road not to the republic, but to the re-total, the total thing, that is, the totalitarian overcoding of social life.